Hello, my strange and unusual friends. My name is Deadly Nightshade, and welcome to Freaky Stories. You may or may not have heard of these stories, but I promise you, you won't be bored. Our story today is called The 9 Lives of Toby the Cat, Part 1. Now, the story starts many years ago, back in the prehistoric era, during the Ice Age, when Toby the Cat first started his 9 lives. Now, back then, he was a saber-toothed tiger, and he was wild and free, catching saber-toothed deers, hunting around, you know, usual animal stuff. Until one day, he met a caveman named Mr. Bones. Very interesting name for a caveman. Anyway, so he met Mr. Bones. He didn't trust him at first, obviously, because they kill and eat animals. Obviously, he's an animal. And they wear his fur coat as a fur coat, obviously. I mean, who wants to have someone wear their skin? That's kind of gross. Anyway, so it took him a while, but Mr. Bones earned his trust eventually. He gave him food like fish and some saber-toothed boar and saber-toothed reindeer sometimes, like the leg or whatever. And they went on many adventures, hunting and killing saber-toothed deers and saber-toothed warthogs and all kinds of creatures to kill and eat back then. Until one day, they bumped into a furry mammoth, a woolly mammoth. Big and huge and hairy. He was furious. He was protecting his flock, the herd of elephants. And Mr. Bones wanted to kill one of them to make a tent out of his body, out of his fur. But the mammoth didn't like that idea, so he came charging at him and hit Toby the cat instead. And poor Toby fell off a huge cliff, all the way down to his death. And that was the end of poor saber-toothed Toby. The end. Part 2. This is the Egyptian times when Toby the cat had a second life. Back then, you may or may not have heard of his owner. I'm not going to say her name because I don't want Miss YouTube to get mad at me. So, I'm not going to say what her name is. But she was a very famous Egyptian woman back in the day. In fact, she was the prettiest of all the land, and Toby was her pet cat. Unfortunately for Toby, her husband wasn't his biggest fan, and he also plotted a horrible scheme. A terrible, horrible scheme to get rid of her once and for all, so that way she couldn't divorce him, and everything she owned, all of her treasures, like her diamonds and rubies and gold, everything she owns will be his, including her land. So Mark came up with a clever idea. Since back then, they didn't know science like we do now, he came up with a clever idea. His plan was simple. He'd get all the security guards to be distracted. While they were distracted, he'd get a black mamba, put it into this chamber room where she would take her milk bath, because they were weird that way. So when she was in the bathtub having her famous milk bath, the black mamba would slither into the bathroom, into the bathtub, and bite her. And then she would die from the venom that it has inside its body. So he got the guards distracted by giving them stupid tasks, like, hey, you over there, clean up that mess over there. No, you over there. There's someone over there. You go over there and check. No, you over there. Yeah, you, get over here. And all this, he's telling them what to do. So when they were distracted, he went into the bath chambers, got the black mamba from his sack, and put it in the cabinet where all the towels were at. And he sneaked out of the room, unaware that Toby was in there having to wash himself, the way cats do. So he's in there, and he's hearing psss in the cupboard, and he's like, what's that? So being the nosy cat he is, he opened the cabinet, and the snake come out at him and literally bit him, wrapped him around, and squeezed him to death, and then swallowed him whole. And poor Toby wasn't alive anymore. And a few hours later, when she went in, the snake bit her and killed her off after she got bitten by it, and she was dead in the bathtub. And of course, Mark was like, oh no, my wife, oh poor me, what happened? Pretending to be the caring husband. And of course, one of the soldiers says, I think she got bitten by a snake. You don't say, he said sarcastically, but they weren't aware of that. So when she died, everything that belonged to her now belongs to him. And that was the end of poor Toby the cat and his owner. The end. Back in the Victorian times, there was a lovely girl named Victoria, and she had the cutest, most adorable little kitten named Toby. He was just the sweetest little thing ever, and she loved him so much. But unfortunately, back then, women had to be in arranged marriages, and unfortunately, poor Victoria wasn't so lucky. She was arranged marriage to a horrible, horrible, nasty old man. His name was Lord Jack. Now, Jack was a doctor. He was in the high guards of the Queen Victoria back then, and his job was to do all the royal doctoring back then, like whenever she was sick or whenever her kids were sick, you know the drill. So back then, he was a royal doctor, so her parents engaged her to him, but she really didn't like him, and he really didn't like her either. She was in her 20s, she was young and spirited and very polite and nice, and he was just stuck up, mean, rude and obnoxious and totally full of himself. So yeah, they didn't really like each other. The only reason why he's agreeing to the marriage is because she's stinking rich and he's, well, a nasty gambler who likes to gamble all his money away. So he was very happy to be engaged to her for her money. But the one thing he hated more than he hated, other than her, was her cat Toby. He really, really hated cats. He was horribly allergic to them. And on top of that, they hated him. Every time he went near a cat, they'd go, meow, and would bite him and scratch him and go, you nasty cat! And then he'd kick them, like the creep that he is. He either punched them in the face or kicked them, and you know what I mean? He was a very nasty man. He wasn't very nice. So one day, he thought, if I'm going to marry this rich, you know what? I'm going to get rid of her cat first. So what he did was, he got a sack, and he grabbed poor Toby, and he put him in a sack, brought him down to the park, and threw him in the water to drown. And poor Toby was no more. And unfortunately, Victoria was forced to marry this horrible man. And boy, was she miserable for years with this man. Had 2 kids with him, and boy, was she miserable. Until one day, she had enough. So she poisoned him. She put poison in his tea. And he was no more. And that was the end of Dr. Jack. You may or may not know him, but let's just say he was horrible in more ways than one. So good riddance to Lord Jack. And poor Toby, God bless you. The end.